What's new, 802? I'm Becca Hammond, and you're listening to Vermont Talks. Vermont Talks may include graphic or explicit content. Listener discretion is advised. Benjamin Roesch, spelled Roesch. Benjamin Roesch is a writer, a musician, a teacher, a podcaster, an award-winning essayist, and he was a high school English teacher at Burlington High for 12 years. Most recently, you've had a novel published called Blowing My Mind Like a Summer Breeze, and it's out now. Benjamin, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
So, let's talk about you before we get into your book, which I'm super excited to talk about the book, by the way.
Okay.
So, where are you from originally?
So that's a little bit of a complicated question, but I'll try to cut to the heart of the matter. So I am from probably Indiana is the easiest answer, but my parents split up when I was quite young, and my mother is from central New York. And so my whole childhood was going back and forth between suburban Indianapolis and upstate New York. So I would do school year in Indiana with my dad, and then my older brother Jacob, and I would go and spend summers and holidays with my mom in upstate New York. So I'm kind of from Indiana and New York at the same time, but I've lived in Burlington for a while, since 2000. So I feel like I'm from Vermont at this point, but yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you had a decade here and you feel like this is your home, you pretty much have assimilated into the culture, I think.
Totally.
So upstate New York, are you talking right across the border? Upstate New York is massive, so I kind of have to ask.
I know. People say that like it's this little place. Like, no, it's this town called Oneonta, which is about an hour west of Albany. It's kind of between Albany and Binghamton. It's a college town. It's a great spot. When I was living in Indiana, it's very suburban, and we lived in this cul-de-sac, and there was not even any sidewalks. There was like no neighborhood feel. And then we would go to my mom's house in this small town in Oneonta. We lived right in town when I was a kid. And it was awesome for me because all of a sudden I could walk down to Main Street. There was a grocery store and a library a 5-minute walk away, and we could ride our bikes all over the place. And it was this great, like, small town kind of feel. And I loved that vibe. I loved that energy of like being one of those kids tearing around the neighborhood on my BMX, and then going to get comic books, and candy downtown, and then being able to come home and being free to roam. Whereas in Indiana, we had like a bigger house because we lived in this kind of nice neighborhood, but it was really isolated, and it was just the house and the yard. So, yeah.
So we were right in the suburbs of the city, or more in the
just
city?
North of Indianapolis, outside of a town called Carmel. So kind of like 30 minutes from downtown, but it felt like it might as well have been 2 hours from downtown because it felt so removed from the city itself.
And what attracted you to Burlington?
Well, I met my wife out in Colorado after I went to Indiana University for college, and right after graduation, I really wanted to get away. I didn't even go to graduation. I loaded up my car and moved out to the high country of Colorado, where my grandparents had a condo that we used to go skiing when I was a kid up in Summit County in this little place called Silverthorne. And the condo was empty most of the time, and I just had this urge to get away. After college, I just wanted to be by myself. I wanted to write, actually. I wanted to write a book. I wanted to read. I wanted to study and just kind of like be a literary hermit guy.
Nice.
Up in the mountains and ski, that too. So I moved out there, and I met Shannon, who eventually became my wife, lived out there for a year, worked in a coffee shop, did some theater. I did write a novel that's still in a drawer somewhere, gladly. And we moved back east because she's from Connecticut, and we had this idea to move to New York City. And so that was our plan. We went to my mom's, we huddled up there for a summer, and then we commuted into the city to try to find an apartment, and we just could not afford anything. It was nuts. I mean, I can't even imagine what it's like to move to the city now. This is in 2000. And it was insane. People would want first, last month, and a deposit, down up front, and we didn't have any money or jobs. And so even though we were good for it in the long run, we just couldn't do it. Like, we literally couldn't get into New York, and we were super bummed. And then we were like literally flipping through an atlas one day. We're like, well, screw it. Let's just go somewhere else. And we were going to move to Minneapolis. I don't know why. Shannon had this friend in Minneapolis. So we're like, let's just put a finger on a map and just go for it. And this buddy of mine called me up, and I was like, hey, he lived in Boston. And I'm like, I'm not going to see you while I'm on the East Coast. Sorry about that. And he was like, no, screw that, man. I'll get you a job at my company. He had just gotten a job with this .com startup, this like high-speed internet sales startup called Flashcom. So anyway, long story short, we moved to Boston. I got a job with this startup selling high-speed internet over the phone. The worst job I've ever had. But I'm so glad I had it because it taught me that I never want to do that kind of work again, like in an office, like on a phone all day, talking to strangers, selling stuff. And then we lived in this really busy part of Boston. Like we liked living there, but it was so busy. We lived right on the Green Line T in Allston, just outside the city. And it was so loud and so busy. And Shannon's sister went to St. Mike's and lived up here in those days. And she had another good friend who lived in Burlington. And we would come up during that year we lived in Boston. We would go to Three Needs and hang out and go to shows. And we just liked it up here. We thought it was really nice. And Shannon wanted to go back to school to be a teacher.
Yep.
And I really wanted to start a band and get into the music scene. And Burlington just seemed like this perfect spot to do that stuff. It had education. It had a great vibe. It had a cool arts community. And in 2000, we just pulled the trigger and moved up here. And we've lived, kind of downtown ever since then. We lived on Booth Street for a while. And then we've lived in our house on North Avenue for almost 20 years now.
Very cool. And you can also ski here, just like you could in Colorado.
This is true.
No, it's a great area. And I always love to hear people's reasons for moving here if they weren't, originally from here.
I know. I think if you went in a time machine and like met me when I was a kid and you were like, hey, you're going to live in Vermont someday, I would say like, what's Vermont?
Right. Right. Well, that's what's funny. Even upstate New York, if you get near Albany, I feel like coming to Vermont's just not a thing they do. If you're from Plattsburgh, they know where we're from. They know what's up, but they don't even come here that often.
Totally.
To be honest. Okay. Awesome. So, and you also, at what point did you start? I always loved asking origin stories. Writer, musician. So you've been writing when did you start writing? Do you consider yourself a lifelong writer from birth?
Yeah, I mean, I'm one of those kind of like annoying, like always knew I wanted to be a artist kind of people. Even when I was a kid, I always looked up to artists. Like they were my heroes, way more than sports people ever were. I always thought that writers, actors, musicians were the coolest. And I acted in plays, even like in elementary school. And a funny story, because I'd kind of like wondered, like, when did I really start writing seriously? I've thought about this. And I knew I did in high school a bit and certainly in college. And I knew before then I had, diddled with short stories and journal writing and stuff like that. But just this summer, my two kids, I have two boys who are 14 and 12, were just out in Indianapolis visiting my dad. And my dad still has some of my old crap in the attic that like every time I go there, he gives me like another box of crap. Like, can I throw this away or will you please take it? And so this time he had a few odds and ends that he had given the kids. So when they got home, they had some random stuff in their suitcase. There was like an attendance sheet from first grade of mine or something, just like,
nice.
Like some pictures, like a bunch of old stuff. But there was this folder and in it was a short story that I had written in fourth grade that I had not thought about or seen like since fourth grade. But I pulled it out and it was like this amazing like time machine. It like sucked me back into fourth grade when I'd written this story. But I was surprised at like how long it was.
Right.
It was like 12 pages long. And I was like, whoa, I don't remember being that serious about it then. I remember just having fun writing this short story. It was like ridiculous conceit. It was about this guy who's having this horrible day and he gets fired from his job. And then he I forget what else happens to him. I should reread it. But then at the end, he wakes up and it's all been a dream. So anyway, I liked to write even as a kid, and I looked up to artists, and I started playing guitar when I was like 11 and got really into music, acted in plays, and I just always wanted to do something like that. For a while, I was really serious about being an actor. And when I went to college, I was a theater major and really, really serious about acting in plays and maybe being in musical theater because I like to sing. I did musicals in high school. And I just always thought that was kind of my trajectory in some way. I didn't quite know how I was going to get there. And then in my early 20s, when I moved to Burlington, I became very serious about making it as a musician. I was in this band. We were like trying to get signed and we were touring a little bit and stuff like that. And I just didn't like the life of a musician. I didn't like being out late. I didn't like being in bars all the time. I just got really fatigued and fed up by that lifestyle. But all along the way, I was always tinkering with novels, screenplays, plays, and just always had this urge to create stuff, whether I was writing songs or whether I was writing books. I just always thought that was a really fun way to spend my time. And I just felt kind of like, if you've ever done it, you know that it's kind of like lonely work in a lot of ways. So if you like to do it, you have to really like to do it. Like, I think a lot of people like think they want to write and then they get bored or they get tired pretty easily.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And what they realize the hard way is that it's actually like a lot of hours by yourself, like just kind of like struggling and just sitting there.
Right. Putting in that effort.
Yeah.
It ends up being a slug. Like most anything in life, right? Where it's actually worth doing and you start getting into it. The initial excitement wears off and that motivation wears off. And then it comes down to hard work and effort. And that's when everyone starts kind of backing off the hard work and effort. Because like the amount of people you meet, I don't know if I've ever met a single person who's ever said, I don't want to write a book. Everyone wants to write a book about something, whatever it is. It could be fly fishing. It could be absolutely anything, but it's really hard to actually do that.
Well, and then, there's writing and then there's writing to publish, which are kind of two different things. If you're serious about getting your work out there, then you have to face a whole other set of challenges and demons and, excitement as well, rejection and getting feedback and putting your work in front of other people. And that's kind of like a whole other part of the artist journey, I think, is when you go from like private to public in how you think of what you're doing. So anyway, long answer to your question, but yeah, I was just always interested in the creative stuff. I just always thought that'd be a noble, fun way to spend time. And I still get amped and pumped about it here in my mid 40s, just as I did when I was a kid. It still seems just as mystical and rad to me as it did 35 years ago.
So your book, I love how you kind of combined, because you talk about you're a musician and an artist, so you like to create this. This novel seems like a beautiful blend of topics you're interested in, and it just sounds really awesome, but I really want to read this book. I wish I'd have so many things going on in my life right now. So I'm going to read the blurb. This was written by Benjamin. Blowing my mind like a summer breeze. This is the blurb on the back of the book, correct?
That's right.
Okay. 15-year-old Rainey Cobb never thought meeting someone could actually change her life. But then again, she never met anyone like Juliet. It's 1995, and the Cobb family band, led by Rainey's rock star parents, has arrived for a week-long gig at the Midwestern resort owned by Juliet's family. Dazzled by Juliet's carpe diem attitude, DIY tattoos, and a passion for grunge, Rainey falls hard. And when Juliet gives Rainey a mixtape that unlocks her heart's secret yearnings, Rainey starts seeing herself and her vagabond showbiz life through new eyes. If Rainey quits the band, her parents' fading career might never recover. But if she doesn't leap now, she might be stuck forever in a life she didn't choose, and always wonder who she could have been. I love this so much. This book sounds so good. I really want to read it. Okay, Benjamin. So, when did you start writing this book?
So this book had a particularly long sort of like gestation period. This is my debut novel, meaning it's the first one I've published, but it's not my first novel. I have a drawer full of other books that I've sort of written over the years, and some may see the light of day, some probably shouldn't. So I tell this story just with a grain of salt because I don't know if it's representative of like all of my stuff necessarily, but this book had an interesting sort of journey. So I was a teacher for a long time. I became a teacher in the mid 2000s. In 2006, I got a job teaching English at Burlington High School in Burlington. Not really having expected to become a teacher. But one of the cool things about being a teacher is that the school district here in Burlington, and I think many school districts, will help pay for some graduate school.
Yep.
You can get like 1 credit or 3 credits, like 1 class a year the district will pay for. So if you are interested in continuing to learn and continuing to take classes, they will support you in that endeavor. And I didn't really want to study education anymore because I loved teaching, but I hated studying education. I just find it really, really kind of tiresome to read about. It's way more interesting to do it. Anyway, so as a way to continue my learning, I decided to get my MFA in creative writing instead of my master's in education. Most of my colleagues got advanced degrees in education in some way, shape, or form. But I thought, well, here could be a cool opportunity to deepen my path as a creative person, but also, as a teacher and just as a human. So in 2014, I enrolled and started working on an MFA in creative writing at Lesley University in Cambridge, Mass. And when you are working on an MFA, you have to do a thesis, and they usually guide people towards short stories as the focus of a thesis because it's easier to wrestle with. It's shorter. Most people who take on novels often don't have time to finish them when you need to. And then part of a novel is kind of hard to critique if you're like a mentor. So even though I thought of myself as a novelist and not a short story writer, I was like, well, maybe I'll try short stories because I'd been reading a ton of short stories. And during my program, I'd read a lot of what are called like linked short story collections, which I don't even know if it's a thing that like people know about that much who don't read like short story collections, but it's basically like a story collection where the stories are not sequential, but they interweave with each other. And sometimes they're about the same set of characters. Sometimes they jump around in time. Like all of sort of connected, linked story collections do it in a slightly different way. But it adds up to this idea that when you're done with the book, you've read a sequence of short stories that could stand by themselves, but you also kind of feel like you've just read a novel in the sense that like the characters sort of speak to each other. They all sort of like live in the same, collected universe, and it adds up to more than the sum of its parts, even though the stories could be read by themselves. So I liked this challenge. I also love music. As we've talked about, I'm kind of obsessed with it. And I've always been sort of searching for ways to get music as an interest into my fiction, because I find that if I'm writing about a topic that I'm really interested in, I find myself drawn back to the page more quickly. Like, for instance, I have another long novel about tennis. I'm obsessed with tennis. I just love tennis so much. And I wrote this book really just to write about tennis. I just wanted to spend all my time like thinking about and writing about tennis. So I just read tons of books about tennis. I just watched matches so anyway, I really wanted to write about music. And so I sort of imagined this group of characters that were musicians. And originally it was really centered around this kind of aging blues musician guy whose name was Cobb. And I pictured Luce as this kind of like worn out, grizzled, heavy smoking, hard drinking, kind of like down on his luck, like formerly abusive to his family, kind of like what I think now is like kind of like an archetypal, like maybe even like stereotyped vision of how we might see that character like in the Hollywood.
Yeah.
I think I described that and people are like, oh, it's like that Jeff Bridges movie. I forget what that one's called. Anyway, so I wrote this group of stories and I had a lot of fun with it. And there was Luce and there was his wife, Tracy. And I imagined that they had been like a famous singing duo when they were younger. Kind of like a Sonny and Cher-ish sort of thing, but with more of like an R&B kind of flair. But then they also had these two kids who were also musicians. And so I imagine this group of people who had been sort of like on the road together and these kids who had this sort of weird, non-traditional upbringing. And the stories kind of jumped around in time. Some of them were when Luce was younger. Some of them was when he was way older. And in the universe, there's a daughter, this girl named Rainey. And she was always part of the story, but she was not the main character.
Right.
So anyway, I'll fast forward a little bit. So I wrote this collection of stories. Fine, whatever. A couple years later, I revisited these stories. I didn't have luck publishing them the way that I'd hoped to.
Short stories. I think Amy actually said that short stories don't publish well unless you're already someone who people know.
Yeah, it's a tough game getting short stories published. There's a lot of journals out there, but it's very competitive, and even good stories can have a tough time getting through. So I revisited this material because I really felt drawn to it. And the last story that I'd written in the collection was unfinished. And it was really just like a couple of pages. But for some reason, it really caught my eye. It was called Juliets Room at that point, and it was just like 3 pages long, and it was just a really simple image. It was this girl, Rainey, when she was 15, and she's standing outside of a hotel room. And on the other side of the hotel room door is blasting grunge music, like she's never really heard before. And on the other side of the door, inside that room, is this girl who she has a crush on. And she's been invited to this room, and she's about to knock on the door, but she's too scared to knock because she doesn't know what she's going to say. She's like enticed by this girl who's cranking her music so loud. And it was set around this idea that this family band ended up at this resort, this Midwestern resort, for like a week-long gig, like a residency that they would do for a whole week. And that was all I had. I just had this idea of this band at this resort for a week, and Rainey's like interested in this girl she's met, but she's too scared to interact with her. And I just thought it was kind of an interesting setup for a story. Like, what if you put these musicians in a place for a week, see what happens? What if you had kind of a crush, first love kind of story that was kind of interesting too? This is
really cool, because it wasn't like you came up with just that singular idea, that you already had the whole universe, and her history, her family was already like, she existed already.
Totally. And so some people have asked me, like, how did you end up writing a book about a teenage girl, especially one who's queer? And I'm, it's like, it was like an interesting odyssey to get to that character.
Right. Like, I invented this universe and she was in it.
Yeah. And it did kind of happen that way. And so I learned this interesting lesson about stories, which is that like they actually kind of change over time. And so revisiting this material was like kind of exciting. And so I rewrote the story, but I wrote it as a novel. And first I tried it as an adult novel that was about Rainey and her mom, and it kind of went back and forth between their two experiences because I realized that it was actually the female characters in this family that were way more interesting to me. This kind of mid-40s, kind of formerly famous musician, Tracy, who was now kind of down on her luck and really frustrated with her life, and the crowds aren't there anymore, and they're not making money. And music has been her whole life. She didn't go to college. And it's like, what do you do? What do you do when you're 20 when your dreams don't work out? What do you do when you're 45 and your dreams don't work out? Like, that's a whole different question. But then I also thought this character of this girl was really interesting. She's a musical prodigy. She's grown up on the road. So what do you do when you've lived life that your parents have set up for you one way, but then you finally get old enough to realize that it's kind of unusual and you're not like other kids? And what would happen if you met someone that made you start to wonder, like, what else your life could be like? So that's these two characters. Anyway, fast forwarding again, I rewrote it a third time a couple years later as a young adult novel told from the perspective of Rainey. And it was at that point that I felt like the story finally like clicked into place. And so it took a while. It took a while to get to this story, to this character, but the journey was really interesting and totally worth it. So like, I think there's a cool takeaway for writers, which is that like, don't ignore the stuff in your drawer. There might be some really interesting stuff in there that could send you in a different direction. Like, don't be afraid to like try a story from another perspective. Don't be afraid to find a minor character and make it the main character. Don't be afraid to go back to stuff because there could be some really interesting stuff there.
Yeah. And the fact that, the fact that you reworked it multiple times, like that's a huge amount of effort and work and just time to put into the same concept, rethinking it versus, I wrote 2 pages. I like, I'm done with it. It's, you didn't give it time to flesh it out, which I think a lot of people, they struggle to write. That's it. They don't give it the time and the effort to let things flush out and see how it's actually play out.
Yeah. I've never been afraid of the work part of writing. And I think it's the part of writing that actually ends up stopping a lot of people from actually doing it. I think people often might claim that they just don't feel inspired or they're not creative enough. But I think sometimes what people are actually saying is that like, it's scary to sit down and do the work.
Right.
That it's scary to live in that place of uncertainty. It's scary to do it every day. It's really hard to do it every day. But for whatever weird, freakish biological reason, I've like never been afraid to just like sit and just do it. And so rewriting it like sounds like this big deal, but to me, it wasn't that big a deal. It was just the next thing I was working on. And so I've never been really shy about just starting over and just doing a whole new thing. So it felt a little scary, but it also just felt like, well, here's the next thing I'm working on. And it worked out.
And you think it's done now? Like you're happy with the story?
Well, it doesn't matter because it's published. And so it's, it's a weird thing to have it be out in the world now. It came out on July 22nd, so it's been out almost 2 months. And so I've published a lot of essays and short stories and stuff. So that's a sense of finality, but this feels like a whole different level of like finality, like seeing, people post on social media that they're reading the book or it's at the bookstore, you can buy it on Amazon or whatever. Like that level of finality is really intense for someone who does a lot of revision and editing because I can't change it anymore.
Right. And how is that process for you, the actual publishing process? You got your third version done. And now, did you start sending it to different, trying to think of the right name here. I'm not going to remember the right name. Representatives that show off your book for you.
Agents, I think. Yeah,
that's the term.
I did. Yeah. I mean, I think the more I talk to people, the more the other writers, the more I find that like everybody's publishing journey is really, really different and really distinct and kind of unique from each other. But there are some central sort of themes in this grand story of publishing anyway. The first, like the overture and like most important thing about this story is that it's so hard. It is so hard to get your work published. And I wish it wasn't so hard because I feel like that could be discouraging to people who want to publish, but it's just brutally hard. It really just is. I think even if you're a good writer, the odds are so stacked against you. And I think the takeaway from that is that you just really have to want to do it. Right. And you have to love doing it. And I think if you do love doing it and you keep doing it, like your work will find its way. Anyway, I tried for a long time to go through a more traditional route, attracting the attention of agents, because I think I'd sort of like, that's just this thing you hear. You got to have an agent. I had embraced that ideology for at least a decade by that point. And I just had accepted it as gospel that like without an agent, like your work's never going to get out there. And there is some truth to that. However, there's actually a lot of other ways to get your work published and seen, and independent, smaller presses is another avenue. And this is traditionally run on a smaller scale. Traditionally, the authors on these presses may or may not have agents, but a lot of them don't have agents. And the difference is that you're dealing directly with the publisher way more, and you don't have this agent as an intermediary. And so I'd never submitted to small presses before. And it was actually my friend Amy Klinger, who's been on this show, sent me a link one day. And she was like, oh, you should check out this small press. And it was a small press called Deep Hearts YA that publishes LGBTQ plus young adult fiction. And they were kind of new. They'd only been around for a couple of years. And I was like, well, that's kind of cool. Maybe I'll give it a shot. So, I reworked my cover letter in that stuff. I mean, at that point, I'd been sitting on the book for a while, and I felt good about my submission materials, because that's the other thing about the publishing journey is you have to have all this other stuff in place. You have to have a query, and you have to have a synopsis of your book, and you have to have this little like teaser snapshot, like the back cover stuff. You have to all these other like peripheral materials just to like get people to consider it.
Because it's like the marketing game more than, I feel so bad for authors because it's the marketing game. Like, how are they going to sell the book before is the book good? When really is the book good should come first. And they almost approach it from a marketing standpoint.
What's brutal about it is that it really messes with your head because most work gets rejected. Okay, so fine. Rejection's part of the process. But like you need to put your work in its best light. And so how do you do that? Okay, you get feedback, you ask for help, you maybe even like might contract like a freelance editor or like someone who can give you feedback on your query. You might pay for that service. You could do all that stuff. You could still write the best possible query letter on the planet and still get rejected. And so like the information you're getting from the publishing side of things is that like your work isn't good enough.
Right.
And yet, like as an artist, you also have to kind of trust yourself and you have to believe in what you're doing. So like it's really hard to like reconcile those two forces because like as you're getting masses of rejection, you develop a thick skin and you really do learn how to let it go.
Right.
But when your work isn't getting bit on, eventually the takeaway is going to be that something's wrong with it. It's hard not to feel like that. So, I remember with this book, I reworked the opening pages so many times because most agents will only ever look at the first 2 pages, maybe 5 pages, maybe 10 at the very most. So you've got a couple of minutes to attract their attention. And so if all of them rejecting it, it must be because your opening pages suck. Like what other information can you take away from that? So then you go get feedback, and the feedback is that actually these opening pages are really great, or it might tweak this one little thing. So you keep tweaking, you keep improving, you keep trying. Anyway, it's just a tough process. It really is. So anyway, by the time I submitted to Deep Hearts, I felt like I'd sharpened my package to like a razor point. Like I felt like I had a great query. I was really excited about it. Like I was genuinely like, I was so frustrated by the process because I felt like I'd written a pretty good book. I felt like my submission package was strong and I just couldn't get over the hump. And so it's just very frustrating. But luckily this small press said yes. It was the first one I sent it to, and they were like, we love this, and we want to put it out.
It sounds like it was a match made in heaven almost.
I guess it kind of was. Yeah, it was just like, it was such a weird thing, when they said yes, and they were just amped about the work. It was just like, that feeling is just really nice, like it reminded me like how infrequently I'd had that feeling over the years. I love writing, but like when you come to like try to put it out in the world, it's kind of a cold process. And so when you have any kind of warmth from other people, especially people you don't know that want to help you, it's kind of an amazing thing. So that was like a year and a half ago.
Nice.
And they were great to work with. With a small press, you're always going to sacrifice some visibility. You're going to sacrifice some promotional funding. They don't have the range to promote work like a bigger press does.
Pockets, yeah.
But what they do have, I think, is like the ability to commit on a more human, personal level with every author. So I got a real personal touch in the process and made friends that I feel like I will have forever. They're interested in doing a sequel, and the book has been successful for them. So it's been a happy ending now that it's been published.
Yeah, that's wonderful, and I'm sure for the kids who find this book and these are the books they're looking for. It's nice to see the same publisher's logo. That speaks to the customer, speaks to the authors they're working with. I love independent anything, any independent business that's cutting through the red tape.
Yeah, that's the coolest thing by far. Like any like struggling artist knows that like when you're not able to get your work out in the way you would like to, you have to like develop like internal resources to keep your flame alive. And I think in that process, you can almost forget that like art is at its best when it's like being appreciated by someone else. Like that's, right. You almost forget like that's the whole point here. Like that's the whole goal. I think I actually forgot that with this book at a certain point. It had been rejected so many times that I think I almost forgot that like other people could potentially read it and really get something out of it. So now that it's been out and, some people have really been touched by it and I've been able to connect on a human level with readers, it's been this like amazing thing. It's like, I feel like it's really refreshed my creative energy and like kind of opened up this door that was always just kind of like closed,
Your possibilities are endless.
Yeah, it's just nice to like, have people read your stuff and just, then at least the work has a chance. You don't expect everybody to like it, but you want it to at least have its best chance, because you did your best with it and it feels like it deserves a fair chance with people. And so I feel like that's what I've been able to accomplish by going with this smaller press. The book's out there, it has a chance now with people. And, at a certain point, you can only control that so much.
So are you excited to start working on something else? Are you the kind of person who never stops writing? Like, no matter what, you might be publishing this book, but you're still working on something else on the side?
Yeah, I mean, I'd already written the next thing and a half by the time this came out. And so it was really important to me to have another thing to work on because I had heard that the publishing process can kind of throw you for a loop emotionally. And that it can be kind of a mind trip. I didn't quite know what that meant, but it's really true. It's extremely true. The publishing process, starting to promote your work and trying to be a public author is a really weird, exciting, but very strange enterprise that's kind of the opposite of being a writer in a room by himself. So I was really glad to have written the next thing and already have a book after that I'm working on. So yeah, I've got another book coming out next year.
Awesome.
It's actually going to be a middle grade novel that I'm doing in collaboration with my brother, who's an artist. It's going to be an illustrated middle grade book.
Oh, that's really cool. Anything illustrated is cool. So anything else specific that you'd like to share about the book? Has it been a wild ride this summer? Have you been getting messages from people you weren't expecting?
Yeah, it has been a wild ride. I mean, I don't know, you try to just sort of like not make too much of the response to it. Like, it's weird. Like you almost don't want to care too much what people think, but it's like, that's almost impossible, So yeah, right. I was surprised how like anxious I felt about what people were going to think of the book because you work really hard on it and you care about it and you want people to like it. And like you accept that people won't like it, but you still, until you experience it, you don't quite know what it's going to feel like when people don't like it. Yeah, the response has been great. It's been super validating and super warm and fun. It has been a bit of a wild ride. I've enjoyed it, but it's also been confusing at times, as well. Like it's like when you accomplish something you really wanted to accomplish, like it feels like it should all be the victory lap. But right. I'll be honest, it hasn't always felt like that. There's been moments where, in 1 minute you feel really excited and really affirmed by the response you're getting, but then 10 minutes later you're like scared for the next response. It is kind of a weird, like vulnerable thing to have it out there.
Oh, sure.
It's a little bit hard to explain, but yeah, mostly it's been fantastic. Friends and living in a literary community like Burlington, it's really thrilling to, have former students read it. My life as a teacher has really come full circle because I don't think I could have written a book about a teenage character without having spent so many years in the classroom. I don't think I would have had the courage or even like the ability to write a character like this without having spent so many years hanging out with teenagers and kind of soaking up their vibe and getting to know them and really learning to like deeply empathize with where teens are at in their lives. I think a lot of adults just kind of forget what it's like to be a teenager.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Just kind of lump all teens together. But when you work in classrooms, if you're going to be a good teacher, like you have to let your guard down and you have to be an empath and you have to listen to kids and you have to take them one at a time the way you would adults. And it was my deep respect for where teens are at in their lives, kind of my love for the journey that they're on that really like gave me, I think, the confidence to write this book. So it's been fun, like seeing that come full circle, like former students sending me emails and being like, yo, congratulations. This is so cool. Or I didn't know you were a writer. Stuff like that's pretty neat.
Yeah, definitely. I'm sure you've got a very unique perspective coming from working in a high school. I don't think I could write about teenage girl. And I was a teenage girl. Honestly, I think that'd be hard for me to get back in that same headspace and not, once your brain develops correctly.
Yeah,
getting back to that emotional, because, God bless kids. They're not the most logical. I was not the most logical. Sometimes the emotions just took you for a ride, and it's really hard to get back into that headspace and to be honest about it and not, because I feel like I'd probably overdo it or underdo it. I feel like I'd miss the mark, and my 16-year-old self would be like, what are you talking about? That's so wrong.
Maybe. I don't know. I feel like there's a part of us, all of us, that longs to kind of be somebody different, and longs to be in another point of view and perspective. I think we sort of take it for granted that artists are going to mostly write about their experience in a very literal way. If someone sings a song and it's got an I perspective, certainly it's about that person, whether that person's a 19-year-old female or a 50-year-old guy. But actually, I think if we think about it, we're all drawn to art and to films and stuff that take us on journeys that have nothing to do with us. Why do we like fantasy? Why do we like sci-fi? What is it in us that wants to live with the elves? That's not our experience. You know what I mean? So I actually think that we're actually very drawn naturally towards other experiences. When I was in college, I was a theater major, I mentioned, and I was an utter failure. I'd been one of those kids who was the lead in my school play. And then I went to a pretty good theater school thinking that I was going to go conquer the place. And I would be in Hollywood in no time or whatever. And I was so humbled so quickly by how much better everybody was than me. It was kind of unreal. I would go to these main stage auditions and the people there really knew how to act and really knew how to dance. And I was just literally faking it. I had no idea what I was doing. I was just an above average, high school thespian. Anyway, because I was so bad, I ended up in this underground scene because I still wanted to act. And I ended up in this kind of crazy underground theater production with this little company that was doing these kind of weird avant-garde shows. And so I did this show called A Summer in Delaware, in which I was just literally living furniture almost. It was two of us and we would just move. And there was one guy who was delivering this long monologue. Anyway, the piece was 18 minutes long and it was set to coincide with the length of a piece of music by John Coltrane called Olé. Coltrane, the great jazz player. And I had to listen to Olé just a million times because in rehearsals, it was all timed to go with the music. And Olé is this long, exploratory, slightly avant-garde piece of Coltrane's work, in the mid-'60s. And at first, I hated it. I was like, what is this god-awful music you're making me? It was horrible. I'd grown up listening to classic rock and then lots of grunge and pop music. I'd never listened to jazz before. And then somehow, I really started to like it. And I said to the director at the end of it, I was like, what is that music? And he gave me the CD, John Coltrane's Olé. And I just it was like a lightning bolt to my soul. I was like, this music is crazy cool. And he gave me some other jazz and I started listening to jazz and I started learning about jazz and all these amazing Black musicians that had created this music and then had brought it into the universe. And somehow that led me on this exploration of reading a lot of Black literature. And I had a minor in Black literature. And I would go to these classes and oftentimes I'd be one of just a couple of white students in the room, which was a really new experience for me. But I just fell in love with the literature of the Harlem Renaissance and writers like Ralph Ellison and Toni Morrison and Toni Cade Bambara. And in hindsight, I realized that I was kind of falling in love with experiences that were not my own. And it's not to diminish my own life, but just to say that I actually think there's a lot of value in pursuing and exploring avenues that don't necessarily hold a mirror up to your experience. Because there's lots of ways to think about the human experience. It doesn't have to be so literal. Circling back to this 15-year-old girl, it's yeah, I've never been a 15-year-old girl, but I've been in love. I've had a first kiss. I've gotten my heart broken. There are core truths about the human experience. And I think you can work your way toward those if you're willing to listen, if you're willing to be careful about it, if you're willing to get feedback. So anyway, just to say that I don't think it's as heroic an endeavor as it might sound like.
If you say that, but I've read a lot of really famous authors' work man, they can't even write a woman to save their life. Like I love Stephen King books, but oh my God, cannot write a woman to save his life.
Yeah.
And the way you just phrased that, the human experience, being in love, it's so simple. You can empathize with any human, right? So it's funny when someone like Stephen King, who sold 1 billion gazillion books, he can't write women because he can't empathize. It's that simple.
Yeah, no, you're right, I suppose. And I did think about that a lot as I was writing. All my early beta readers for this book before I even started submitting it for publication were all women readers. And, partially I just wanted them to call me. Can I swear at all?
Oh, yeah, go for it.
I wanted them to call me on my bullshit if there was any bullshit to be called on. And so I needed to know early on, just give it to me for real. Do I sound like a guy writing about a woman? And is it really obvious? And because I knew if it was really obvious and it was there on the page, that nobody would buy this book and that I would have to stop right then and there. And luckily the feedback was kind of the opposite. It was no, I'm not sure I would have even necessarily known. It feels authentic to me anyway. And so you just take that one at a time. You don't want to assume that person's speaking for all people, but it gave me some confidence as I started to hone the book. And as I went deeper into revision, I just sort of kept, going back to that feedback and people saying, no, you're okay, keep going. Because I didn't want to be flippant about it. I knew what I was doing was a little bit delicate.
Yep.
And was taking a bit of a risk. And so I tried to just say, well, if you're going to take a risk, control what you can control. Risk is where the juice is at in life. So you have to take risks to grow as a person, no matter what it is, whether it's a job or a relationship or a creative endeavor. You can't just sit still. So you can't be afraid to do it. But the tools you have are feedback, revision, time. And so I was well, I'll control what I can control. I'll get other people to read this. I'll invite feedback. I'll sit with it. I'll really do my best to try to make sure that it's as authentic as it can be. Because ultimately, when someone sits down with a book, you want them to disappear. You don't want them to think at all about who wrote it. I think that's challenging too, especially now. I think we're more aware than ever of who's creating what. And I think those questions are really interesting. But in terms of writing this character, I felt like I did my due diligence to try to do it as well as.
And some of the greatest books of all time written by someone of the opposite gender of the main character. And I think that's the sign of a very good writer, where it's so seamless that you don't even know. Who wrote this book? Oh, it was a man? I never would have thought it was a man. Or it was a woman. I never would have thought that a woman could have written about a man's experience just well.
Yeah.
It's that putting the human experience into things. I kind of wanted to touch on that because I think it's so important that just giving empathy to everyone can really, it's not that complicated. So it is funny when, and that said, I really like Stephen King, and some of these really prolific authors just.
No, you're right, though.
They might be really talented, but man, they lack some little piece of empathy. I think it's empathy or something like that, where they're just not quite putting themselves into.
Yeah, there's something. You're right. There is often a little bit of a gap. I think sometimes it's about exposure too. I think about teaching a lot and how just much time I spent with different kinds of people, and how I think if you go to the root of going off course here a little bit, but if you go to the root of discrimination or reasons that people think they don't like other people, I think oftentimes underneath that is actually just a lack of exposure. You haven't spent time around X category of person. And so therefore you maybe just believe what you heard on the news or see in a movie or something like that. But as a teacher, there's just nowhere to hide.
Right.
You are just in there with everybody. And, Burlington, even though Vermont is a very white state, actually Burlington is more diverse than people think it is. And when you go into the schools, you really see that. We're a refugee resettlement community. And, the difference in who was in my classroom from 2006 to 2012 was actually quite profound. I would have students from all over the world, different kinds of students from different economic backgrounds, students from different religious backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, and you've just got everybody in there. And part of your job as a teacher is to help people be better citizens and better humans. And part of that's teaching people how to listen more to each other and how to empathize with each other's experiences. So I actually think a lot of the work of being a good teacher is part of the work of just being a good human.
Right. That empathy. And
yeah,
it's fun. It's kind of interesting at that level where everyone's so young still. And it is a melting pot. And You as a teacher have to build in respect for everybody, and it's not a political statement. It's just we have to be good to each other because we're here to learn in this classroom right now.
Yeah. Something I see too that really pisses me off a lot is I feel like the way the culture like represents teens is often very like one note and very surface level. And I think people often do it intentionally. You know, they group teens into categories. You know, you see a lot of like, I think archetypal like shows and movies, even something as good as Stranger Things. I don't know if you've seen Stranger Things, but I actually think is really, really good on a lot of levels. But I think to me, one of the central weaknesses of that show on a story level is that it still like really buys into this like categorization of kids on a really surface level. And like those categories do exist, but they're never as simple as they're made to look, I think, on TV. And so what I'm always trying to do, like when I'm working with kids, is like take people like one at a time. And I think oftentimes like adult creators make the mistake of thinking that like teens' lives are just really simple. You're either this or that. You're either a jock or a dork. You're either like a theater kid or the prom queen. Like there's no intersection. Like there's really no commonality. But that's actually kind of stupid, you know? And like, again, those categories do exist. We all probably felt them when we were kids, but like our own struggles as young people were super authentic and real. And I think
and very complicated.
Super complicated. Like I think now as an adult, I look at like my teen kids and I'm like, oh my God, I'd love to have that much time. I'd love to have life be that simple. But then I pause and I'm like, no, that's wrong. Because like for them, their lives are just as complex and just as fraught with danger and confusion as mine is. You know, you just learn to get better at managing it over the years. I think it's like another trick a little bit to writing teens.
Yeah. And one of the things thinking back after going to college, I just think about, oh my God, I used to sit through 8 different classes a day. As an adult, my brain would just be a puddle on the ground because college, I went from 8 classes a day down to 2, maybe 3. And now if I tried to do it at a 14-year-old kid does as a freshman in high school, I would be probably really exhausted.
Yeah, it'd be brutal.
Like, it's not easy, man. Every now and then I'll have a dream where I'm back in high school, and those are the moments where I'm like, oh my God, there's too much to do.
Yeah.
Like, this was a really stressful period of time. And I think as we get older, we kind of forget that feeling, oh my God, I'm in high school. It's too much.
Yeah, for sure. And kids are like more stressed out and overscheduled than ever. And so like their lives are super busy. Like even my older son's life, you know, between school and homework and practice and social commitments, like I'm tired just looking at this kid.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Like,
so we went kind of long talking about this, but this was good. Great topic. I really wanted to discuss this. Excuse me. Frog in my throat. Is there anything else that you'd like to touch on? Because we're kind of, we're definitely running long. Is there anything else that you'd like to share, Benjamin, before we cut it for the rest of the day?
I don't think so. This was fun. I appreciate you having me on to talk about, I always feel like when I'm doing something like this, I don't even know what I've said. I feel like I kind of go into this like weird place in my mind. But no, it was fun to talk about this. Thank you for giving me a chance to chat and giving the book some love. I hope that this helps other people find it. And
hopefully other authors help find you. I don't know if you need to come back on the show when you finish your other book.
Oh, actually, I did want to give one other little mini plug since we're doing a podcast, which is that I'm doing a musical companion podcast for my book that'll probably come out like maybe in the winter sometime. So my book is about this young musician, but there's this musical world in the book. And so I'm doing a musical companion to the book. So each episode will deal with a musical topic that the book deals with. So it's not about the book. It's about like musical topics from the book. So for instance, like my character is a teen prodigy. So I have an episode about musical prodigies. She's a great singer. So I have another episode about like what makes someone a great singer or not. So like 12 to 15 minute kind of short episodes. So if you like podcasts, hopefully it'll be kind of a fun little bonus round.
Very cool. Yeah. And they can find out more about that on your website, I'm guessing?
Yeah, that's as good of a place. Benjamin Roesch, BenjaminRoesch.com, or I'm on Instagram at Benjamin Roesch Writes.
Very cool. And what's that going to be called?
I don't know yet. I think I might just call it Blowin My Mind Like a Summer Breeze, the podcast, just to simplify things. Yeah,
that's a really cool idea. You should definitely come back on the show because we have a lot of other things we could talk about. Okay, thank you so much, Benjamin.
Thank you,
Roesch, for coming on the show. Check out his book, Blowin My Mind Like a Summer Breeze. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on Phoenix Books. Can you find it locally?
Yeah, you can find it at Phoenix. You can find it at Crow. You can find it at Flying Pig Bookstore. You can find it at Barnes & Noble in South Burlington.
Cool.
Most local places have it.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much, Benjamin, for coming on the show. The show notes for today's episode will be at vermonttalks.com/33. Thanks so much for listening to the end of the show. Subscribe to Vermont Talks on your favorite podcasting platform. You can find me on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, all over the web. Contact Becca at vermonttalks.com if you'd like to be interviewed or if you know someone who should be. Thanks so much to Jason Baker for creating the show music. The views and opinions expressed by the guests are those of the individuals and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Vermont Talks. Any content or statements provided by our guests are of their opinion and are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, individual, anyone, or anything. And that's what was new in the 802. Have a great day.